In this video, we're talking about how to convert between fractions, decimals, and percent. And we're just going to do a couple really basic examples to show you the general idea. So we have this chart here. We have 1/2 as a fraction. We need to change it into a decimal and a percent. We have 0.4 as a decimal that we need to change into a fraction and into a percent. And we have 65% that we need to get into decimal form and into fractional form. So let's go ahead and skip the 1/2 for now, because when you start with a fraction and you need to get into a decimal or a percent, that's going to be the hardest thing. Going from a decimal to a fraction or a percent, or going from a percent to a fraction or a decimal, is actually pretty easy. So if we're starting with a decimal, in this case we're starting with the decimal 0.4. To go from decimal to percent is really easy. All we have to do is move the decimal to the right 2 spots. So here we have 0.4. If I go ahead and write my 0.4 over here, all we need to do to get this from a decimal to a percent is to move the decimal point over 2 spots. So we go 1, 2 spots, and then we fill in any of the spots here with zeros, and then we put a percent sign after it. So 0.4 is actually 40%. Similarly, going from a percent to a decimal, going in the opposite direction, is going to be really simple. Instead of moving the decimal to the right 2 spots, we're going to move the decimal to the left 2 spots. So what we need to recognize here is that we have a decimal point right here. This is 65.0, you can think of it as. So if I do 65 here, and I have my decimal point right here, instead of moving it to the right 2 places to go from decimal to percent, since I'm going from percent to decimal, I just move it to the left 2 places. So 1, 2. And if I had to fill in with any zeros, if this was just 5%, I would move it over 2. I would have to fill in this spot with a 0 here, but I don't have to fill in any of my spots with zeros here. I can just say that my decimal is 0.65. That's going to be the same thing as 65%. So decimal to percent, you move the decimal to the right 2, percent to decimal, you move the decimal to the left 2. So that part is really easy. Now, how do I get from decimal numbers to fractions? Well, all I have to do is remember my place value, right? If I have 0.00000, I know that this is the tenths place, I know that this is the hundredths place, and I know that this is the thousandths place, and I could keep going, but really I just have to remember my place value here. So when I look at 0.4, I know that the number ends in the tenths place, right? The 4 is in the tenths place here. So I just take my 4 and I put it over 10 because the number ends in the tenths place. So I say that this is 4 over 10, and then all I have to do is see whether or not I can reduce my fraction. And in fact, for this one, I can divide both the numerator and the denominator by 2 and get 2 over 5. So 0.4 is the same thing as 4/10, which reduces to 2/5. What about 0.65 here? Well, I can see that the 6 is in the tenths place. I can see that the 5 is in the hundredths place. The number ends here in the hundredths place, which means I have to put 65 over 100. So 0.65 is 65 over 100, and then I just have to see if I can reduce this fraction. And in fact, I can divide both the numerator and the denominator by 5, and I'm going to get 13 over 20. So 0.65, 65%, is the same as 13 over 20. So again, going from decimal to fraction is all about just place value here, and that's pretty simple. So you can see how if we start with a decimal or if we start with a percent, filling in the rest of this chart is pretty easy. If we start with a fraction, it's just a little bit harder because to get to a decimal or a percent, obviously this one, 1/2, we should know off the bat is 0.5 or 50%. But if we didn't know, if it was more complicated, in order to get from a fraction to a decimal, what we have to do is divide the denominator into the numerator. So to get over here, I have to say 2 into 1. And now I just have to do my long division. So remember that this is like 1.0 here. When I'm doing long division, I always just bring my decimal point straight up here. So I'm going to put my decimal point there. And now I do my long division. 2 goes into 1 0 times. 0 times 2 is 0. I subtract 1 minus 0, and I get 1. Now I bring down my 0 here, and I say 2 goes into 10 5 times, so I get 5. 5 times 2 is 10. 10 minus 10 is 0, so I know I'm done. So now I can see that my decimal is 0.5. So that's how you convert. Clearly this one was obvious, but it's not always going to be obvious, and if it's not, then you can just do long division like this. So of course, once we get into our decimal form, getting to percent is easy. Again, we just move our decimal over 2 spots to the right, so 1, 2. we fill in with zeros and put a percent sign, and we can say that 1/2 is equal to 0.5, which is equal to 50%. So that's how you convert between fractions and decimals and percents. If you start with a decimal or a percent, it's pretty easy to get the other two. If you start with a fraction, you may just have to do your long division to get to decimal, and once you get to decimal, it's really easy to get to percent.